Something unexpected just happened in Texas, and it has nothing to do with oil wells, fracking, or anything most people would immediately think of. A 5.1 magnitude earthquake just struck deep in the heart of Texas ranch country. And the truly strange part of this story isn't the shaking itself. It's what's buried thousands of feet underground. A geological scar so ancient, so similar in structure to the fault system behind one of the deadliest earthquake sequences in American history, that scientists are still struggling to explain exactly what triggered it. Stay with me, because by the time this video ends, you'll know exactly what's hiding beneath the Texas Panhandle, why experts can't agree on what caused this, and what it might mean going forward. Thursday morning, before sunrise, the ground beneath a quiet stretch of Texas Panhandle ranchland suddenly lurched, hard. A 5.1 magnitude earthquake. For this part of Texas, that number is genuinely shocking. Most people hear Texas earthquake and instantly think fracking. But here's something worth understanding right away. A quake this size would be considered large, even if human activity was directly involved. Standard fracking-related tremors typically register below magnitude 1. Now, they're so small, most people never feel them at all. Yes, drilling operations can occasionally trigger stronger earthquakes, but only when they directly intersect a pre-existing fault. What happened here is different. This one made national headlines within hours. Here are the facts everyone agrees on. Time, 5:21 in the morning. Location, Roberts County, Texas. Rural ranchland near the Oklahoma border, close to the small town of Miami, Texas. Felt across Oklahoma City, Tulsa, southwestern Kansas, and even parts of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. A smaller aftershock followed later that same day, hundreds of miles south. No fatalities, no major structural damage reported. But here's where it gets interesting. After this earthquake hit, I went through coverage from nearly every major outlet reporting on it, and I noticed something strange. None of them could agree on how rare this event actually was. Some called it the strongest earthquake ever recorded in the Texas Panhandle. Others said strongest in over a century. A few specified it as only the fourth earthquake of magnitude 4, or higher documented in the region since 1900. So which version is correct? The answer turns out to be more interesting than the disagreement itself. There's an older Panhandle earthquake from the 1930s that was reportedly measured at magnitude 5.4. But here's the catch. There was no seismograph anywhere near that area at the time. Scientists of that era reconstructed the earthquake's size entirely from secondhand accounts, letters, newspaper reports, descriptions of cracked plaster on interior walls. That estimate may well be accurate, but it's fundamentally different from a number captured in real time by modern instruments reading the ground directly. So, when outlets describe this week's event as the strongest ever recorded, they almost certainly mean the strongest ever measured by an actual seismograph, not necessarily the strongest earthquake to ever physically occur in that region. Once you understand that distinction, most of the confusion disappears. It's less like reporters getting facts wrong and more like comparing an old hand-drawn sketch to a high-resolution photograph, and then arguing about which one shows more detail. Here's where the story takes a genuinely surprising turn. The Texas Panhandle has actually been quietly producing earthquakes for over a century. Records of seismic activity in this specific area stretch back to 1907. Since then, researchers have documented roughly 20 separate earthquakes across that general region, including 3 that crossed the magnitude 5 threshold back in 1925, 1936, and 1948. So what exactly is sitting underneath all that flat, quiet cattle country? There's a fault system buried beneath this entire region, and it is ancient in a way that's almost difficult to fully comprehend. Geologists have traced it back to something called the Amarillo-Wichita Uplift, the buried remains of what's known as a failed continental rift. Roughly 500 million years ago, long before dinosaurs, long before anything with a backbone had crawled onto land, the North American continent actually began tearing itself apart in this exact location. It started splitting, and then it simply stopped. The crust healed back over, leaving behind a long buried scar, weaker than the surrounding rock, more fracture-prone, sitting there silently for hundreds of millions of years at a stretch, until the right combination of stress eventually reawakens it. That scar is still there, right now, underneath Texas wheat fields and cattle ranches. Scientists have put 4 separate explanations on the table. None of them have been eliminated yet. This is currently the leading natural explanation. Tectonic stress builds slowly across entire continents over geological timescales. Occasionally, that accumulated stress finds the weakest available point in the crust and releases there. In the Texas Panhandle, that weak point happens to be this same ancient failed rift system. Under this explanation, no human activity is required whatsoever. It's geology doing exactly what geology has always done, operating on timescales that make an entire human lifetime look like the blink of an eye. This one rarely gets mentioned in current coverage, which is exactly why it deserves attention. Several older Panhandle earthquakes, including ones from 1936, 1966, 1974, and 1980, occurred directly above major petroleum fields that were actively being drilled at the time. Researchers who studied those historical events suggested they may have been triggered by that earlier oil production activity. However, those same researchers were honest about a significant limitation. The equipment available at the time simply couldn't pin down the precise depth or location of those earthquakes with much accuracy. This remains a genuinely open scientific question. This is the explanation most people immediately reach for, and it's worth taking seriously because it's a real, well-documented phenomenon. Researchers have clearly established cases in Oklahoma and parts of West Texas where pumping leftover fluid from oil drilling deep underground has measurably triggered earthquakes along nearby fault lines. However, officials responding to this specific earthquake have been notably careful, stating publicly that more data is needed before drawing any firm connection. A magnitude 5.1 is genuinely large for an injection-triggered event, and unlike the extensively studied cases in the Permian Basin, this particular earthquake simply doesn't have that same weight of supporting evidence behind it yet. This might sound unsatisfying, but in this specific case, I'd argue it's the most honest answer of all four. Within hours of this earthquake, scientists were already saying publicly that determining the true cause of an event like this takes real time, careful data collection, and detailed geological modeling. In science, we don't know yet isn't a cop-out. It's usually the most accurate sentence available, and here I genuinely believe it is. Here's the detail that genuinely surprised me during research. Geologists studying the Amarillo-Wichita Uplift have noted that it shares a strikingly similar geological structure with something called the Reelfoot Rift, another ancient failed rift system buried deep underground in a completely different part of the country. That rift sits directly beneath the new Madrid region, where Missouri, Arkansas, and Tennessee all meet. That is the zone responsible for the legendary New Madrid earthquake sequence of 1811 and 1812. Widely considered among the most powerful earthquake sequences ever recorded in the continental United States. Multiple massive earthquakes struck that region over just a few months, strong enough to ring church bells hundreds of miles away, to be felt along the eastern seaboard, and to permanently reshape parts of the local landscape. Some historical accounts from that era describe the Mississippi River appearing to briefly reverse its flow direction. To be completely clear, no scientist is suggesting Texas is due for anything remotely similar. Nobody's predicting a new Madrid-scale disaster in the Panhandle. What geologists are pointing out is something narrower and honestly more interesting than a simple disaster prediction. Both regions share the same fundamental geological ingredients, an ancient, failed rift, buried deep, silent for enormous stretches of geological time, following the same basic structural recipe. One of these scars just happens to sit beneath Texas ranch land instead of beneath the Mississippi River Valley. The USGS ran its post-event forecast within hours. The probability of another earthquake of similar or greater size occurring within the following days came in at approximately 2%. Small, but not zero. Their damage assessment came back showing low overall risk, largely because the population density across that rural stretch of the Panhandle is extremely low. But here's why the actual magnitude matters statistically. The Panhandle has now experienced roughly 4 earthquakes of this size or larger within approximately a century. That works out historically to somewhere around once every 25 to 30 years. Push the threshold slightly higher, to around magnitude 5.5 or 5.6, and the frequency drops to roughly once every 50 to 100 years. Push it to magnitude 6, and you're looking at something closer to a once in 3 centuries event. So this 5.1 isn't a bizarre statistical anomaly. It looks much more like a clock finally striking the hour it was always eventually going to strike. Nobody knew precisely when that hour would arrive, because that's simply how earthquakes work. There is no precise advance warning system. There never has been. There's one more detail worth addressing clearly. A second earthquake, measuring approximately magnitude 3.9, struck later that same day, hundreds of miles south of the main event. It was geologically unrelated to the ancient rift system beneath the Panhandle. It briefly generated confusion online, with some people assuming the two events were connected or that one was an aftershock of the other. They were not connected. Texas is simply a large state with multiple separate zones of seismic activity. Some ancient and largely natural, others more directly tied to modern industrial operations. 2 unrelated earthquakes occurring on the same day in completely different regions is a coincidence of timing, not evidence of a connected event. Since the question of human versus natural origin keeps coming up throughout this story, here's how researchers actually approach that determination. They examine the almost precise depth dots of the earthquake. Injection-triggered events tend to cluster at depths, closely matching the depth of nearby disposal wells. They study the exact location relative to active injection sites. They analyze Or timing, checking whether seismic activity in a region increased noticeably after nearby injection operations ramped up. And they compare the specific fault that ruptured against broader regional stress patterns already mapped by geologists. When enough of these factors align, researchers can build a reasonably confident case. When they don't align cleanly, as appears to be the situation so far with this Panhandle event, the scientifically honest position is to withhold judgment and continue gathering data rather than rushing toward a conclusion. There is a peer-reviewed study from 2022 that examined earthquake activity across the Texas Panhandle between 1983 and 2018. The research found a sustained rise in smaller earthquakes, magnitude 2.5 and above, over that multi-decade window, with the majority showing signs, consistent with underground wastewater injection from oil industry operations. That's genuinely useful context, but it's important to understand what it does and doesn't tell us. That earlier research focused on large numbers of smaller routine earthquakes accumulated gradually over decades. It was not specifically studying an isolated event anywhere near magnitude 5. Which is precisely why officials have been so careful about extending that same explanation to cover this specific earthquake without further investigation. So here's where things actually stand. The ground shook harder in the Texas Panhandle than any seismograph has ever directly recorded there before. That part is settled. 4 separate explanations remain technically on the table, and scientists haven't settled on a single one yet. And underneath all of it sits a geological scar that's roughly 500 million years old, sharing its fundamental structure with the fault system responsible for one of the most powerful earthquake sequences in American history. What happened in Texas wasn't impossible. If anything, it was something that had been quietly preparing to happen long before the state of Texas existed in any recognizable form. That ancient scar was already sitting there in the ground, accumulating stress, waiting. The only question that was ever uncertain was exactly when. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, subscribe, because we cover exactly these kinds of strange, underreported natural events every single week, explained clearly and honestly. Drop a comment below. Had you ever heard of the Reelfoot Rift or the new Madrid earthquakes before watching this? I genuinely want to know. I'll be watching for any new developments out of the Panhandle. And I'll bring you an update the moment there's anything meaningful to report.